Rock talks before it moves, if you know how to listen. Not poetically, not metaphorically, I mean literally, in the specific groan and crack pattern a stope ceiling makes in the hours before a fall, a signature I've spent 19 years learning to hear underground at the Kestrel Ridge copper mine, first as a junior blast engineer, then as the man who now signs off on every charge pattern before it goes into the rock. This is a story about my father, Harlan, who spent the last 4 years of his career building the optimization system that decided those charge patterns across all 6 of the company's mines, and about a Tuesday morning when his system's aggregate math looked at the exact sound I'd learned to fear most and called it noise. My name is Caleb Voss. I'm the senior blast engineer at Kestrel Ridge, the mine my father worked for 31 years before he moved up into corporate innovation, and for the last 2 years, both of us have been living inside the same argument about a machine learning system called Strata Optim, a disagreement that started as a professional difference of opinion and ended, on one particular Tuesday, as something considerably closer to a decision about whether I trusted my own father's life's work over my own 2 ears. Strata Optim went live across the company's 6 underground mines 4 years ago, an optimization platform designed to calculate blast charge patterns, drilling sequences, and/or extraction routes by training on seismic, geological, and production data pooled across every site the company operated, a genuinely enormous dataset that let the system identify efficient extraction patterns no single mine's engineering team, working in isolation, could have modeled on their own. My father had championed the system from its earliest proposal, arguing correctly that 6 mines each solving the same geological problems independently, without ever comparing notes at scale, was leaving both safety margin and/or yield on the table. The whole value of Strata Optim is the pooled dataset, Caleb, he told me, more than once, across a kitchen table I'd been eating dinner at since I was a boy. A pattern that looks like nothing at Kestrel Ridge alone becomes obvious once you can compare it against 5 other sites with similar geology. That's not something your ears, however good they are, can ever do alone. I don't disagree that the pooled data catches things I can't, Dad. What I'm telling you is that pooling 6 mines together also means the system's treating a signal that's rare across the aggregate as noise, when at this specific mine, with this specific fault structure, it's not rare at all, it's the single most reliable warning sign I've got. I want to be fair to what Strata Optim actually got right, in the same way I'd want anyone to be fair to my father's 31 years underground before he ever touched a keyboard for a living, because this isn't a story about a system built carelessly, or a man who stopped caring about the men and women working beneath the surface the moment he moved upstairs. Strata Optim's pooled charge pattern optimization had measurably reduced overbreak and improved extraction efficiency across the company's mines for 3 straight years, exactly the kind of careful, defensible engineering my father had built his entire second career on, and I never once doubted that he believed in it completely. What the system didn't have, and what nobody building it had fully understood the danger of, was any way to weight a signal differently depending on which specific mine it appeared in, when that signal's meaning genuinely did change from site to site, buried underneath a pooled dataset that, by design, treated 6 very different rock bodies as variations on the same underlying pattern. I need to explain the specific hazard this story turns on, because it's the actual center of everything that happened that Tuesday, and because it's exactly the kind of narrow, site-specific pattern and optimization system built around a pooled, cross-mine dataset was never designed to individually weight. Kestrel Ridge sits on a geological formation the other 5 company mines don't share, a fault structure running diagonally through the ore body that creates a very particular pre-failure seismic signature, a short cluster of low-frequency microtremors in the 12 hours before a stope roof lets go, a pattern I'd first learned to recognize from an old-timer named Gus Pellerin who trained me my first year underground and who'd survived, barely, a roof fall in the 80s that nearly nobody walked away from. Gus used to say the rock gave you exactly one honest warning before it decided anything, and your entire job was making sure you were paying attention when it did. Across the company's other 5 mines, that same tremor cluster pattern appeared only rarely, and when it did appear elsewhere, it correlated with roof failure far less reliably than it did at Kestrel Ridge specifically. A different Strata Optim's pooled model had no mechanism to weight, because the system's training treated the 6 mines' seismic data as one combined statistical population rather than 6 geologically distinct ones. Averaged across that pooled population, the tremor cluster registered as a low confidence, frequently false positive signal, exactly the kind of noisy pattern a well-built optimization system is specifically designed to learn past, to avoid triggering unnecessary work stoppages across a company that measured its efficiency gains in exactly this kind of noise reduction. I'd raised this specific gap with my father nearly 8 months before this story's events, after StrataOptim's automated risk assessment had cleared a blast pattern I'd personally flagged for manual delay, based purely on hearing that same tremor cluster on my own seismograph readout the night before. I'd held the crew back an extra 6 hours on my own authority that time, waited out the pattern, and watched a section of stope ceiling I'd have otherwise had men actively drilling beneath come down clean and empty 2 hours after my delay window closed. That's one data point, Caleb. I believe you that it happened exactly the way you're describing it, but StrataOptim's confidence interval on that signature is built off 11 years of pooled seismic data across 6 sites. I can't have Kestrel Ridge unilaterally overriding a system-wide risk model based on a single incident, however dramatic. It's not a single incident, Dad, it's the 4th time in 6 years I've personally held a crew back off that exact pattern, and the 4th time the ceilings come down within hours of my delay window. I don't have 5 other mines worth of data, I've got Kestrel Ridges, and at Kestrel Ridge, that pattern isn't noise. Gus had been gone almost a decade by then, but I still thought about him every time that tremor cluster showed up on my seismograph readout, the particular way he used to crouch at a drift entrance with his palm flat against the rock face, not because he could feel anything useful through solid stone, but because he said it slowed him down enough to actually listen. He'd walked me through the 1987 fall exactly once, reluctantly, on a night shift when I was young enough to still think caution was mostly a matter of following the posted procedures correctly. He told me about the low groan that had built for most of a shift before the roof let go, a sound the 2 men who didn't make it out had apparently written off as ordinary settling noise, the same kind every stope in the mine made 100 times a shift without incident. Gus said the difference between that ordinary noise and the real thing was never loud or dramatic, it was a specific rhythm, a clustering, and that a man who spent enough years underground eventually learned to feel the difference in his chest before his ears fully caught up to it. I'd carried that lesson for 19 years without ever needing to fully explain it to anyone who hadn't lived it themselves, and I found myself, more than once across that 8-month argument with my father, wishing Gus were still around to explain it to a machine learning system on my behalf. The morning this story turns on was a Tuesday in late October, a scheduled blast in the 4 North Stope, a section of the mine carrying unusually rich ore grade that had made it a priority extraction zone in that quarter's production targets, StrataOptim's automated sequencing having cleared the charge pattern the previous evening based on its full risk assessment, seismic readings included. I was in the engineering office at 4 in the morning, reviewing the overnight seismograph data before the day shift's pre-blast briefing, when I saw it, the same low-frequency tremor cluster, faint but unmistakable, sitting in the previous 6 hours of readings from a monitoring station roughly 40 yards from the planned 4 North charge pattern. StrataOptim's own dashboard had already processed the same readings and cleared them, its confidence score for the tremor cluster sitting comfortably below its system-wide action threshold, a threshold built, as always, off 6 mines worth of pooled data rather than Kestrel Ridge's specific 444 history with this exact signature. I called my father directly, aware it was still early enough that I was likely waking him. Dad, I've got the tremor cluster again, 40 yards off the 4 North charge zone, same signature as the last 4 times. StrataOptim's cleared it because the pooled confidence score doesn't weight it the way Kestrel Ridge's own history would if the system were looking at us in isolation. Caleb, the system's risk assessment factored in current seismic data along with the geological model for that specific stope. It's not ignoring your site's data, it's weighing it against a much larger pattern set that's proven more reliable than any single site smaller sample, including ours. I need something more than, it happened 4 times before, if you want me to authorize a company-wide production delay on a priority extraction zone. I want to describe what I actually did next, because it fell partly within my formal authority as the site's senior blast engineer and partly, honestly, outside the specific protocol the mine normally followed for a system-cleared charge pattern. Under Kestrel Ridge's site safety bylaws, any licensed blast engineer held standing authority to delay a scheduled charge pattern for up to 12 hours pending manual geotechnical review, regardless of strata-optim's clearance, an authority written into the bylaws specifically to preserve exactly this kind of professional override in a system otherwise built to minimize exactly this kind of delay. I walked out to the 4 North Access drift myself before the day's shift arrived, met the crew foreman, a steady, unflappable woman named Priya who'd worked under me for 6 years, and asked her, as a site authority decision rather than a chain of command order, whether she'd support a 12-hour manual delay on the charge pattern pending an additional geotechnical scan, a request that would cost the shift its full production target and that I'd made perhaps 4 times across 19 years. Always on mornings that carried exactly this signature. Priya didn't hesitate. You've called this pattern right every single time I've worked under you, Caleb. I'll hold the crew back myself if I have to. 12 hours against a section of ceiling coming down on somebody isn't a hard call from where I'm standing. I logged the delay formally, requested an independent geotechnical scan of the 4 North Stope roof using ground-penetrating radar, a scan that fell outside strata-optim's own automated workflow and that I'd requested, by my own count, perhaps a dozen times across my career, almost always on mornings that felt exactly like this one. The geotechnical crew arrived within 2 hours, running ground-penetrating radar across the 4 North Stope ceiling while I stood at the drift entrance with Priya, both of us watching the scan technician's monitor rather than the rock itself, since whatever was happening up there wasn't yet visible to the naked eye. The waiting itself had its own particular weight, the kind I'd felt exactly 3 times before across 19 years, standing in a drift with a delayed crew and a production schedule slipping further behind with every passing minute, knowing that if the scan came back clean, I'd have cost the shift its full target on nothing more than 4 data points and a dead man's decades-old advice, and knowing that if it didn't come back clean, the alternative was standing considerably closer to a section of collapsing rock than any of us wanted to think about directly. Priya kept the crew staged well back from the drift entrance the entire time, running through equipment checks that didn't strictly need running, the particular busywork of a foreman keeping her people occupied rather than watching a monitor screen for 2 hours alongside her engineer. I caught myself doing the same thing with my own hands, running my thumb along the edge of my hard hat's brim, a habit I hadn't noticed in myself since the last time this exact pattern had shown up on my readout 3 years earlier. The scan found it roughly 90 minutes in, a hairline fracture plane running diagonally across nearly 11 feet of the stope roof, invisible from the drift floor, structurally consistent with exactly the kind of pre-failure condition Gus Pellerin had spent my first year underground teaching me to listen for. A fracture the scheduled charge pattern would have driven a full drilling crew directly beneath within the hour if I hadn't held the delay. 11 feet of fracture plane, Caleb. If that section had let go with a full crew drilling underneath it, we're not talking about a production delay anymore. Priya's voice carried the specific flat calm I recognized from 19 years of exactly this kind of moment, even as her hands, I noticed, weren't entirely steady around her radio. I photographed the scan results myself, logged the fracture plane's full dimensions against my own seismograph readings from that morning, and called my father a second time, this time with something considerably more concrete than a 4th data point sitting in front of both of us. My father drove out to Kestrel Ridge himself that afternoon, having pulled strata-optim's original clearance assessment and cross-referenced it against the geotechnical scan the moment word reached the corporate office that I'd delayed a priority production blast against the system's recommendation. I want to describe the conversation honestly, because it wasn't simple vindication for either of us, even with an 11-foot fracture plane sitting in hard data in front of both our eyes. An 11-foot fracture plane, Caleb. That's not a marginal call, that's the difference between a delayed shift and a crew underneath a collapsing stope roof. I've been telling you for 8 months that this signature reads differently at Kestrel Ridge than it does pooled across 6 sites, Dad. I didn't have anything beyond 4 incidents in my own ears until this morning, because that's not the kind of evidence strata-optim's built to weigh against 11 years of pooled seismic data. Which is exactly the gap I need to sit with, and I know that now in a way I genuinely didn't let myself believe 8 months ago, when you first raised it. I wasn't dismissing you because I stopped trusting your judgment, Caleb. I built my entire second career on the belief that a bigger, pooled dataset beats any one site smaller sample, and I think I let that belief run further than the data itself actually supported, right up until this morning made the gap impossible to keep deferring. I know that, Dad. I'm not angry at you for trusting a system you spent 4 years building carefully. I'm telling you that the one time it mattered, treating Kestrel Ridge's specific fault geology as just another data point inside a 6-mine average would have put Priya's entire crew directly under 11 feet of fracturing rock. He was quiet for a long moment, looking down the drift toward the 4 North Stope entrance, and I watched him run the same calculation I imagined he'd been running since the scan results reached his phone, the particular engineer's math of how many other blast patterns, across 4 years and 6 mines, might have carried the same invisible per site gap without one stubborn engineer's ears happening to catch it in time. I keep thinking about the version of this Tuesday where you'd let it go after I pushed back on the phone that first time, he said, finally, or the version where Priya hadn't backed the delay without hesitating, because I outranked the call on paper even if I didn't outrank it underground. I don't like sitting with how much of this morning came down to you personally deciding not to drop it a second time. I don't love sitting with that either, Dad. A system this good shouldn't need one engineer's 4 data points as its last line of defense before a crew walks under a fracturing roof. That's not a compliment to me, it's a description of exactly the gap we both need to close. You built something genuinely good across 6 mines, and I've never once told you otherwise, but genuinely good isn't the same as finished, and I think somewhere in the last 4 years you let yourself believe it was closer to finished than it actually was. You're not wrong, he said, and I remember being a little surprised at how quickly he said it, without the reflexive defense I'd half expected after 8 months of exactly this argument. I think I wanted the pooled model to be the whole answer, because the whole answer would have meant I'd finally built something that didn't need 31 years of somebody's ears underground to catch what it missed. I'm not sure that answer exists, Caleb, and I think some part of me has known that since long before this Tuesday. The 4 North Stope's charge pattern went forward 6 days later, after a full remediation of the fracture plane and an extended 24-hour monitoring window that came back clean, a delayed production target that cost the quarter's numbers considerably less than a roof fall would have, though nobody outside the engineering office ever framed it that way, since a fracture caught in time doesn't make for much of a story to anyone who wasn't standing in the drift that Tuesday morning. What my father and I built together over the following months, working with StrataOptim's development team directly, was a site-specific weighting layer added to the pooled model, allowing each of the company's 6 mines to maintain its own confidence threshold for seismic signatures proven, through that site's own incident history, to behave differently than the pooled average suggested, closing the exact blind spot that had let 4 years of otherwise excellent cross-site optimization miss a pattern real enough to nearly collapse a stope roof onto a working crew. I still walk out to 4 North some mornings, more out of habit than necessity now, since the seismograph dashboard flags Kestrel Ridge's specific tremor signature automatically these days, no manual override required. Priya still brings it up occasionally, over coffee in the crew room, the particular 12-hour delay neither of us has ever needed to explain twice to anyone who's since heard the full story. My father and I talk about StrataOptim's ongoing refinement most weekends now, over the same kitchen table I grew up eating dinner at, except the conversation carries a specific new weight neither of us fully had before that October Tuesday. He told me once that the hardest part of the whole episode wasn't the engineering fix at all, it was sitting with how completely 11 years of clean pooled data had let him believe a system-wide confidence threshold was fundamentally sound, right up until his own son's stubborn insistence on trusting 19 years of one particular mine's rock finally made the gap impossible to keep deferring. Rock talks before it moves, if you know how to listen, and what I've learned, watching a system my own father built get this one thing wrong for 8 months before finally getting it right, is that the rarest, most site-specific knowledge is often exactly the kind of good pooled model, optimizing against everything it knows how to formally average, will keep missing longest, simply because a fracture that means everything at one mine can look like statistical noise everywhere else it's measured. It took an 11-foot hairline crack, a 12-hour delay, and a father and son who trusted each other enough to argue honestly across a kitchen table, to finally close a gap that 4 years of otherwise excellent engineering had never quite found its way to on its own.